Yeah. So we have a chapter by Deborah Baumgold. I would recommend you not refer to Baumgold. There's a whole bunch of scholars in the text whom Baumgold refers to. So it's like it's not good form to refer to textbooks. Like nothing horrible is going to happen, but it's, you know, if you do, but it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. If you are intending to get first class honors, this definitely detracts from your paper. Again, if you are referring to somebody or something in the text, you should either refer to let's say the thinker himself, in this context Hobbes, or to world class renowned commentators on Hobbes, and we're going to have 7 names, right? Approximately, maybe more. So Macpherson, Taylor, Warrender, you know, Gene Hampton, etc., etc. We'll go over them today, right now. At least in broad outline. Yeah. So yeah, so that's I guess the basic idea. Oh, if you refer to other philosophers, again, remember the references should be short, focused, to the point, help you answer the question. This is going to be an issue that you will be faced with, right? So you already know something or will have learned about the commentators, right? But not all the commentators relate to all the questions. So, for example, very famously, very importantly, Taylor Warrender, talking about laws of nature, this is more relevant when we discuss state of nature, right? Or certain aspects of sovereignty, such as how do the laws of society relate to the laws of nature. But in general, like not every question on Hobbes should, not in every question on Hobbes should you go into a deep discussion of Taylor and Warrender, right? So it's, may look like a waste that you have this wealth of knowledge and not be able to apply it, but it's important to be to the point. If the question is asking about something, your answer should relate to the question. And again, let's imagine your question is about sovereignty. Yeah, Taylor Warrender is less applicable to that. But even if you refer, try to, if you want to show your understanding, you need to be able to tie uh, um, this into with the question somehow. Anyway, so let me also. By the way, probably a good idea to open the text on your own as well. So. I know that there are better ways of doing this. Students have pointed me to online software that allows multiple people to open and comment on PDFs at the same time. Maybe, yeah, if I had just slightly more time, I'd try that. But for this time, we're just going to proceed in the following way. So, okay, so we have a whole bunch of questions here, right? So, is Hobbes an egoist? Um, is Hobbes a social contract theorist? So strong students among you should not be surprised with this formulation, right? So there are questions whether Hobbes is a social contract theorist at all, right? And incidentally, I have to tell you that I myself, as a Hegelian and as a Marxist, I don't believe in the social contract. I don't think social contract is a good idea, right? And in this sense, in fact, the fact that Hobbes is not a social contract theorist is his strength in my reading and in my opinion. Again, I am sometimes, you see, like on the University of London, I encourage you to take a stand. On the University of London, I encourage you to take a stand. Like even if you don't have a strong opinion, take a stand. And this is to some extent what I'm doing in the lectures as well. I don't really have such a strong opinion on whether Hobbes is a contract theorist or not. But at the end of the day, we'll look at arguments from Plamenetz. I think Plamenetz is right. Ultimately, Hobbes is a defender of de facto authority. There's nothing genuinely contractarian about that. And the most important contractarian thinker in our course, Locke, I'm not really fond of. His arguments, not because I don't like the conclusions, but because I think that the arguments themselves are not very robust. So anyway, this is an important line of reasoning we're going to come back to. Anyway, so okay, we have this term solipsism, right? I found it and I lost it, right? So solipsism, from something like solus ipse in Latin, which means only I or only me, right? I shouldn't waste time on this right now. But again, broadly, the strong version of solipsism is the idea that only you exist, like in the entire world, and the entire world is figment of your imagination or something. The weak version of solipsism is just this idea that human beings are, in a very important respect, our thinking is self-referential, right? Like, for example, what Hobbes would say, that whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire is that which he calls good, right? And the object, so goodness or good or evil are simply questions of our appetites, right? So this is, you could say, a weaker version of solipsism, that we do not have access to the external world, but again, our thinking is self-referential. So like even if we, for example, even if we act altruistically, we always act altruistically out of ultimately egoistic motives. So altruistic behavior due to egoistic motives, right? So this idea that you help, parents help their children because they like their children, because parents actually, in helping their children, they do not want the children to be happy. Parents want themselves to be happy, and by making the children happy, they actually enjoy this. The example that Hobbes himself actually gives somewhere is that he says that people give pity, человек дает милостыню, to relieve himself from the pain of compassion. So you walk down the street and you feel the pain of compassion, and you don't care about the beggar. You do not care about the beggar, but you care about yourself. And for your sake, you give, you throw a couple coins towards the beggar. Anyway, yeah. So again, this idea that thinking is necessarily self-referential. And okay, so, and there's this interesting question of solipsism and egoism that I'll have to, well, actually, I mean, this is exactly what I've been talking about. So we are solipsistic, we're locked inside our head, which need not be equivalent to holding that we are necessarily self-interested. So again, so I should delete this comment from here, right? And I should insert it here. We are not equivalent to holding. So not equivalent to holding. So you can be altruistic, but actually only for egoistic reasons at the end of the day. But you can be altruistic. So it's like it's important, right? So anyway, so the last section, okay, separates three veins of contractarian reasoning to show the importance of the idea of consent. Yeah, so this is by far the most challenging and the most problematic part of Boucher, I feel. Anyway, let me try to go over this quickly. So, I mean, okay, so, yeah, somewhere, right? No, yes. Um, just let me note again this identification in the past of Hobbesism with atheism. So this does not resolve the question of whether Hobbes was an atheist or not. Hobbes has complicated, confused, and maybe undecided theology. It's like we're not going to answer this question definitively. However, it's important for us to understand that Hobbes was perceived as an atheist for a very long time. Anyway, um, let me continue. Yeah, okay. So we have these terms important to keep in mind, I guess. Mm, I probably don't want to go over this because this is clear. Okay, so um, so here we get some phrases. This one, right? Because a state of nature would be a state of war, individuals in such a condition would choose to enter into social contract, creating absolute government, preferably taking the form of monarchy, right? So the way I like to phrase this is that, because there is no natural cooperation, as they say here, because humans are antisocial by nature. Um, um, only an absolute government can guarantee peace. Nothing short of absolute government can guarantee peace. Um, Maybe let me even write this: because humans are not naturally social, nothing short of absolute government can guarantee peace. Mm-hmm. Um. Okay. Yeah. So here we talk about egoism. Yeah, I think this is somewhat less important. I would advise you not to spend a lot of time on this, right? But they talk about these three positions, how anyway, many readers have taken this to imply that Hobbes holds us to be naturally self-interested. Others argue, however, that he's an egoist only in the formal sense, that he makes it true by definition that whatever an individual wants is in her interest. A third camp rejects entirely the egoist characterization, arguing instead that Hobbes' political theory presupposes us to be moral agents who acknowledge and obey the natural law. So this third camp is Taylor Warner, okay? And I'm not sure. It's like I don't want to harp on this too much, but I disagree with Taylor Warner. I think it's very important to understand what their arguments are, but I don't actually expect anybody to take their position. And now you can feel free. But if you find their arguments implausible, don't worry, you're not alone. In fact, Boucher is going to, I mean, Deborah Baumgold in this article is going to advance some arguments against um, um, Taylor Warner. Anyway, so yeah. Anyway, so another issue that they're talking about is whether Hobbes is a contract thinker at all. Whether Hobbes is a contract thinker at all, right? And so this is John Plamenaz, right? And perhaps Hobbes. Let me find this. Perhaps Hobbes would have done better had he explained political obedience entirely as an effect of self-interest and fear, had he spoken only of maxims of prudence in the state of nature and never of divine laws such as promise keeping. Yeah, so I have to tell you, I am very sympathetic to Plamenas's position. I am very sympathetic to this position. That like in principle, at the end of the day, if you read Hobbes carefully, tacit consent is presumed. You cannot withdraw your consent. So why is this social contract? It's not clear, right? To me, I don't think it's actually the word social contract is actually useful. So I agree with again this de facto line of argument that if you're being protected, you should obey because this is in your interest. Well, I mean, yeah, you could say this is contract in a sense that still legitimacy of the government is derived from the consent of the governed, and on some very deep level it's true, but it's like again, if you remember this example that Hobbes gives about a robber pointing a gun to your head and asking, like saying your money or your life. This is, according to Hobbes, this is supposed to be a free decision. Well, I want to say that in the colloquial sense of the term, this is not really a free decision. So I'm not sure if it's such a good idea to call Hobbes a contractarian. Although, again, we'll talk about this. We'll talk about this down the line. I shouldn't talk about this now. I should make a note and talk about this later. But it's like I was actually thinking the other day. People tell me, "Oh, but today you can emigrate. You can go from one country to another country." And How would Hobbes? So Hobbes on immigration. You cannot see me writing because I'm writing a note for myself, right? But the idea is that, like, if you move from Somalia, let's say to Germany, you only get the rights in Germany at the mercy of the German people. So this is what I think the Hobbesian argument is, right? That at the end, the German people, the German sovereign can decide to give you rights, but rights in this sense are not natural. It's not like you had natural rights even in Somalia and Germany enforces them. No, Germany gives you rights. This would be the Hobbesian interpretation. Anyway, sorry, this was a separate point. Anyway, yeah. So we talk about actually I think the next topic that that Deborah Baumgold is going to talk about is exactly Taylor Warner. So let's focus on this issue. So we talk about this making and keeping promises. This is what is at stake in Taylor Warner in many sense. Making and keeping promises. So when we say making and keeping promises, this first and foremost means keeping the social contract, right? Because the social contract is also kind of a promise, right? So this is why making and keeping promises is important in this context. Anyway, so okay, some think that Hobbes explains promise keeping in terms of self-interest. Some think that Hobbes explains promise keeping through this independent account of moral agency. This is Taylor Warner. and others think he does not have a satisfactory answer to this question. So in many ways, this is keeping the social contract. So this is the famous, the dreaded fool's problem. Could you break the social contract if it's in your immediate interest? And Hobbes says, no, you should never break the contract, but it's not clear exactly why. And one possibility is that Hobbes is simply confused, that he is, what's the right phrase? He is engaging in wishful thinking. Let me even add this, wishful thinking on the part of Hobbes. Hobbes is wishful thinking. Let me explain this briefly. So it's like Hobbes cannot really resolve the fool's problem. So he just, makes some gestures. He imagines that he has explained it, whereas in fact he has not. Anyway, yeah. So here they talk in the next passage. They talk about okay, command theory of law. I'm not sure if this is all that important. Let me underline this because it's there. But very important. Well, I would say for me, importantly, later utilitarians actually regarded Thomas Hobbes as a proto-utilitarian. So later utilitarians saw Hobbes as a proto-utilitarian. Anyway, so here's the this is actually there's only a couple paragraphs in Boucher about Taylor Warner. But let's try. Anyway, so the next wave of interpretation made Hobbes over from a proto-utilitarian into a natural law thinker, arguably a forerunner of Kant. So, and again, I have to signal that it's a possible interpretation. It's very important. This interpretation is very important as a contrast. But at the end of the day, I don't expect people to actually go along with this interpretation. Anyway, so in 1938, this is a fairly old interpretation, Alfred Taylor brought out an article on Hobbes' ethical doctrine that was sharply critical of prevailing egoistic interpretations. I'm probably actually going to open this article. While granting that the theory includes an egoistic psychology, so there is an egoistic psychology in Hobbes, there is an egoistic psychology. So psychologically, Hobbes is an egoist. However, Hobbes also has this deontological moral theory. So deon is the Greek word which means duty. So deontology, the most so a deontology is ethics of duty. This is most famously associated with the idea of Immanuel Kant, that the right thing to do is what you are obliged to do. Now, in this particular sense, you have made a promise, you have made the social contract, so you promised to keep the social contract, and so you are obliged to do that, and so this is the right thing to do. So this is the important point of contention here, right? Anyway, so account of our duties, most especially our duty to keep promises, and as contrasted with his egoistic interpretation of our description of our motivations. Although this theory could be described in Kantian terms as consisting in an account of moral imperatives, Taylor thought it finally required a theological foundation. You see, this is why I keep calling Taylor and Warner theological interpretations of Hobbes, because for Taylor it requires a theological foundation, and indeed it is problematic. It is very problematic because Hobbes held God to be incomprehensible. In effect, Taylor depicted Hobbes' political theory as a modern contractarian variant of traditional natural law philosophy. 20 years later, Howard Warner elaborated Taylor's thesis in a natural law interpretation of Hobbes' account of political obligation. Basic to Hobbes' moral theory, he argues, is a distinction between the moral obligation to keep promises, which applies universally, and validating conditions, which make the obligation operative by eliminating fear as excuse for non-performance. So, moral obligation to keep promises, which applies universally, this is in foro internal, and validating conditions, this is in foro external. In foro internal, and the validating conditions, this is in foro external. So what the hell does this mean? It means that in the state of nature, you make promises, maybe, or maybe you're forced to make promises in the state of nature, but you should not keep them, because he says, laws of nature oblige in conscience always, but in effect only when you are in security. And if in the state of nature you keep promises, you simply destroy yourself. I hope that this is clear. It's an important point, and I kind of hope that it's clear. If it's not clear, feel free to ask, right? So again, in the state of nature, if you make a promise and you keep it, more often than not, like usually under normal circumstances, you are simply destroying yourself. Because in a condition of the state of nature, of mere nature, where nobody keeps promises, to be the only person who keeps promises is, as Hobbes would say, against the reason of your self-preservation. So this is against your self-preservation, leads to your destruction, right? So in the state of nature, you are not supposed to keep promises, right? But Warrender says, and it's true, Hobbes actually says this, you should want to keep promises. You should want to keep promises in foro internal. I must want to keep promises. But I should only keep them, but I should only keep them when in security. When I say security, I mean under the social contract, right? That's the basic idea. And anyway, so according to Warrender, there's a prima facie. Prima facie means at first sight. Prima facie obligation to keep promises even in the state of nature, but performance of the obligation would be suspended until, with a political covenant and institution of sovereignty, the causes of insecurity are removed. Thus, political authority is the validating condition for the performance of moral duty. While agreeing with Taylor that the idea of universal law requires a theological foundation, so agreeing with Taylor. So it's important. Again, this is why this theological reading of Hobbes. Warner rejects Taylor Kantian spin on the argument. Taylor opposed moral duty to egoistic psychology, whereas Warner thinks duty and interest cohere at the theological level. Fear of divine punishment furnishes a self-interested motivation for the performance of these duties. So we're gonna. This is. I think there's gonna be at least one other line on Taylor Warner, because they're going to talk about how Quentin Skinner actually believes. Yeah. So there's another issue that we'll come back to. Quentin Skinner, who's a very important interpreter of Hobbes, says that Taylor Warner is wrong. So much of subsequent interpretive literature has been devoted to rebutting Taylor Warner's thesis, elaborating one version of another, all the egoistic understanding. The first attack, blah blah blah. So again, let's keep in mind. We're going to come back to this, but we're talking about Quentin Skinner, super important, very famous political philosopher from the University of Cambridge, I think. He's Skinner and Goyce are the two editors in chief of the Blue Book series, the Blue Book series of Cambridge texts in the history of Western political philosophy. So the texts that we're using for all thinkers, for all texts, well, not all texts, but right, for all thinkers in this course. Anyway, so yeah, let me dwell on Taylor Warner just a bit further, because this is some explanation from Baumgold, but this is not full explanation. So let me give you some pointers. Maybe let me first of all say this in my own words, and then I'll show you the text. So in my own words, Taylor is basically harping on the fact that if you promise to do something and then you don't do it, you run into a logical contradiction. So again, Taylor says that there's an egoistic psychology, but on top of the egoistic psychology, there's the deontological moral theory. So more specifically, I'm trying to find my comment. I have this somewhere. This is strange. Well, anyway, let me add this here. So we have this deontology, specifically duty to keep promises. Again, the idea for Taylor is that if you promise and then you don't keep your promise, you run into a contradiction. So promising and not keeping a promise is a logical contradiction. I have to tell you, I disagree with this view vehemently. This is actually what Kant also says. And I don't buy this idea at all. I think this is horrible moral philosophy. I think this is horrible moral philosophy. Like, it's completely incoherent. So basically, what Taylor is saying, is that lying is not only immoral, but lying is irrational, right? So it is irrational for me to say, for example, that let's say I promise that the next class is going to be on Rousseau without intending to make the next class on Rousseau. Now, again, if I say it out loud, if I say these words out loud, the next class is going to be on Rousseau, but actually it's not going to be on Rousseau, right? You would think that there's something wrong with my speech, right? You would say, Alex, you must have misspoken, right? You must have meant something else. What is it? What do you mean that the next class is and is not going to be on Rousseau? Like, is half a class is going to be on Rousseau, or what, right? Or like, so I don't know. Let's say I promise that the exam is going to be on the 5th of May, but actually the exam is not going to be on the 5th of May. I don't know. It's going to be on the 6th, right? Again, if I say these as a word, as a phrase in English language, it sounds self-contradictory. Right? And it's true. So far I agree with Taylor. Sorry, to use phrases like these is to misuse English language. However, there's nothing illogical about saying that one thing is going to take place, but actually secretly thinking that another thing is going to take place. It's called lying, and people do this all the time for all sorts of reasons. Some reasons may be bad, some reasons may be good. Who knows? Very famously, Immanuel Kant maintained that nobody should ever lie for whichever reason, and I am not sympathetic to that statement. And Kant himself actually shows, I think, why this is an extreme view to take and not really very tenable, because he says, like, even if, let's say, a murderer is knocking on your door, since Kant is, well, do I want to give Nazi analogies? Whatever. I'll leave it to you. Take this example and rephrase it in terms of the Nazi Germany, right? Anyway, so Kant is saying the murderer is knocking on your door and is intending to kill somebody whom you are hiding in your house. Should you tell them? And Kant says you have to always tell the truth. And Kantian logic is, I suppose, at the end of the day, is very simple, right? Do what you must, happen what may, right? You do the right thing. Your conscience is clear in the face of God, and then God will take care of the rest. Okay, so the murderer kills your children or something like that. But so what? Your conscience is clear in the face of God. Well, some people do live lives like this, right? I'm not saying it's impossible to think like Kant, but I don't think it's good advice. I don't think it's good advice. Anyway, so go back. Let's go back to Taylor. So actually, I promised, and I wanted to, and I think I'm gonna open Taylor's own text a little bit. So again, so if you go to Hobbes, if you go to further, and if you go to books, well, it's not exactly books because Taylor's article is only 20 pages long approximately. But and I think if we just search for the words Kant, oops, we'll find. So it's less than 20 pages. Yeah, unfortunately, this text is a little bit broken. If I will not be able to find this quickly, I'll drop it. Hmm. Anyway, okay. So you can read this on your own, I guess, because unfortunately, the search, I'm searching for the word Kant and it highlights something else. It's not 100% sure. Well, no, actually, I found it. So again, so you have this idea that so Taylor is saying that Hobbes is like Kant, in most ways, but the key difference is that again, Hobbes, for his own reasons, reduces all injury to the violation of an express or implied promise. Hobbes, for his reasons, reduces all injury to the violation of an express or implied promise. And for Kant, you have this universalization of maxims, which you're not really going to write about on the exam. But again, if this is unclear, if you want, talk to me. So, like in many ways, this is the key phrase in Taylor. But this is on page 409. Anyway, I could talk about this more, but I don't want to waste time getting bogged down in the fairly obscure text. Okay. So yeah, so and Warrender actually gives us a short explanation of his own views and how they're different from Taylor's. So this again, Warrender and Taylor, we have these 3 pages, and Warrender actually summarizes Taylor for us. Yeah, and again, let me close. Let me close this list. Let me go back to the text. The ultimate idea, the ultimate point, is that let me try to clarify. Maybe even, you know what? Let me go to the slides. Let me try to make this a slide. Okay, whatever. So Taylor Warrender. So so the standard atheistic interpretation is that promise keeping is only a matter of self-interest. If you want, like it's not a real duty. It is a duty to yourself. Like the laws of nature, right? Because that's the idea of the laws of nature, that you should the laws of nature prohibit a man from doing what is destructive of his life, right? But what Taylor Warrender are saying, so Taylor is saying that you must keep promises, otherwise you run into a logical contradiction. And so you have so it is a real duty to keep promises. And Warrender is basically saying, you keep promises and God will reward. And again, I think it's important to keep Taylor Warrender in mind, because ultimately, what is the option? What is the option of this whole discussion? What is the conclusion of this whole discussion? The conclusion is that by comparing the standard account, account versus Taylor Warrender, we can see that Hobbes doesn't really have laws of nature, doesn't really have laws of nature. So they are not really laws, they're just recipes. So not laws, but recipes, right? Of course, if you want to defend Taylor Warrender on the exam, what I wrote here doesn't really apply very much, but it's up to you. Okay. This is not the end of the story. This is not the end of the story. But if you want to go deeper, again, I suggest you look in Taylor and Warrender. It's not. It will not take you long, because again, the bit in Warrender that we need is only 3 pages long, and the bit in Taylor is just search for Kant, okay, in the text. Maybe we'll come back to this at a later point in the discussion. Anyway, I hope that this is approximately clear. However, I want to finish with Taylor Warner and maybe even give you a chance to ask questions. So if we go to the next page, they say that one can sum up the range of mainstream interpretations, range from Bentham to Kant, Thucydides and Buchanan. So Kant, Taylor Warner, right? And where's my Skinner? Yeah. Here you go. So Taylor Warner thesis again we have. And in attacking Taylor Warner thesis, Quentin Skinner highlights, which was written after the regicide fall of Stuarts, explicitly justified submissions to a conquered regime. The rational choice approach. Okay, whatever. No, there's another passage about Skinner. This is strange. Hang on, this is not the passage I was looking for. Okay. This is here. Sorry. I jumped a bit too far. Anyway, so Skinner launches a historical attack on the Warner thesis, whereas Macpherson claims whatever. Skinner focuses 17th century reading of the theory. So basically, what Skinner is saying is that this stuff. Oh, you cannot see the slide. You see the slides and not. Yeah. So basically, this whole stuff that you saw on the slides, right? This is Taylor Warner is a bad reading of Hobbes because Taylor Warner thesis is historically incredible. So historically speaking, nobody has ever Hobbes this way. That this is kind of some new and strange interpretation which appeared in the 20th century, but doesn't really refer to Hobbes in any serious fashion. Again, so we have this apologists for de facto authority, and I keep repeating this phrase, de facto authority. In many ways, it's meant to contrast with the notion of contract. Contract presupposes consent, right? Your conscious legitimation by the subjects of the government, whereas de facto authority just says whoever is in charge, you should obey. Whoever is in charge, you must obey. That's the basic idea. Again, and you have this phrase that we keep repeating: it's mutual relation between protection and obedience. In other words, contemporaries did not take Hobbes to be a natural thinker at all, but thought his theory grounded in political obligations in self-interest. Nor did they take the theory to be essentially contractarian, since de facto argument derives subjects' duty to obey from government's power rather than their consent. Duty to obey is derived from government's power and not really from consent. So power to protect. Duty to obey is derived from government's power to protect and not their consent. Yeah, and this is, you will not have a lot of time to write about Taylor Warner. So I would say that for the majority of students, this is enough. For first-class honors, this is probably not enough. But first-class honors should open the text of Taylor and Warner and actually look at it more carefully themselves. Let me pause here because this is a very important chunk of Hobbes, and this is this issue that we keep talking about, keep circling around over and over and over again. This idea of whether Hobbes is uses the phrase laws of nature. What is the meaning of this phrase laws of nature in Hobbes? Okay, let's maybe pause for a second. Vladimir, you have your hand up, no?
Well, I had, I'm not sure if this is like an appropriate question because it's, I think I know the answer for this question, but when talking about this rationality of lying, well, you gave us example of our seminars, and you like you frequently say that our seminars resemble the free and equal discussion of John Stuart Mill, and maybe the validating conditions or infer external is like maybe resemble this kind of situation, because the example of murder is, well, not at all a secure situation, and maybe you are forced to lie. And but well, my answer would be that situation of free and equal discussion um, is not Hobbes, and this is why we cannot apply this thesis to Hobbes, and that you basically said that it's not applicable to Hobbes. But what
Mm,
are your thoughts?
mhm. No, I think that's a very important question. And Hobbes is not the end of the story, right? Well, I mean, Hobbes himself has some ideas in chapter 30 about positive freedom. But again, from Aristotle to Hobbes's chapter 30 to then very especially Rousseau and Hegel and Marx, right? There's this notion that in a well-ordered society, the interest of the individual and the interest of society coincide. So I could, so again, let's say we have a seminar. I could lie to you about Hobbes. I could give you a misdescription of Hobbes. But why would I do that? Why would I do that, right? So because if I mislead you about Hobbes, right, the truth will come out one way or another, right? And also, you have to understand that, like, if I am passionate myself about understanding Hobbes, it is important for me to be able to have a free and open discussion with you, because otherwise, how do I know? How can I be sure that I'm not mistaken about Hobbes? So again, I want to say that our situation is very clearly a situation of self-interest. But the question is, I think for everybody, for Hobbes and for Rousseau and for Hegel and for Marx, is what happens in some fringe cases, what happens in the marginal cases. Because again, like ever since, okay, let me go back a step. So there's a very famous thesis by Leo Strauss, and the thesis goes like this: that the ancient political philosophy was interested in virtue. The ancient political, so Strauss. So the ancient political philosophy was interested in virtue and how to make people good people, right? And the modern political philosophy, starting with Machiavelli, assumes that people are vicious, or at least not naturally virtuous. Not naturally virtuous. I don't really want to use the word vicious. We talked about this with respect to Hobbes. Um, Human beings are not really bad. They just do whatever they can to survive, right? So humans are not naturally virtuous. And the question is, how can we make institutions, how can we have institutions that will force less than virtuous people to behave pro-socially? Mm-hmm. So, and I think that this is, again, this is the question that we get starting with Machiavelli, and this, it's a question with which political philosophy struggles, right? And I think we can see some examples where it's uh, it's working, in the sense that we have a working solution. There are some situations where we seem to be able to have a working solution. Like I am, like this class, I think we're fine. Like I don't lose sleep over what's going to happen to this class. But if you think about, I don't know, nuclear proliferation or global warming or pollution, you see, you run into very different problems, and especially like, so a free rider problem for me in this course, or for you in this course, is minuscule. It's tiny. But think about the CEOs of large corporations, or think of presidents of large nations, right? So as let's say, as somebody who's in a position of power, you can uh, be accountable to the people and use your power for the common good, or you can, take advantage of the situation, and again, be what Hobbes calls a fool, right? And in the short term, this may win you a lot of, I don't know, glory, prestige, even more power, whatever. But in the long run, you are jeopardizing the situation, right? Um, Klosko discusses this problem with respect to David Hume when he talks about artificial virtues and natural virtues, but also notice, yeah, notice that Mill is very much preoccupied with this, right? So he talks about laws and regulations, education and public opinion, right? And all of these are actually supposed to enforce the collaboration, cooperation of citizens. Again, this is I mean this idea that prisoner's dilemma is at the heart of political philosophy in general, right? Uh, what am I driving at? It's it's a prominent idea. I don't think it's a bad way. I do not think it's a bad way to summarize the idea of the key idea of political philosophy as the prisoner's dilemma, the key problem of political philosophy. Notice that the foundational text in the history of Western political philosophy, Plato's Republic, in many ways begins with this precise problem, right? Because when Glaucon talks about the ring of invisibility and says, let's suppose I could do injustice with impunity, would I do it then, right? So the person, the Gyges, right, the shepherd with the ring of invisibility, is the perfect fool for Hobbes, right? Because mm, mm, he can do whatever he wants with impunity. Because, like, again, remember, for Hobbes, human beings are naturally mistrustful, we live in a condition of scarcity, indifference, but we're also approximately equal. Well, the ring of invisibility uh, uh, makes you no longer equal. Now you are superior to other humans. You are immune to, what's the phrase? Immune to punishment, right? I don't know, Vladimir. Does this answer your question?
Not sure, but it definitely is a food for thought.
Yeah. Again, I feel that uh, like in my own head, um, this is a super important question, and on my pessimistic days, I'm thinking of the failed prisoner's dilemma game, right, and how humanity can screw itself over, right? I don't want to bring in the Fermi paradox, but those of you who are familiar with this phrase, Fermi paradox, and great filters, again, this notion that conscious life in the universe. This is a hypothesis by famous Italian American physicist Enrico Fermi, right? That conscious. Well, this is one of the potential solutions to his paradox, right? That conscious life first develops the means of destroying itself, and only later develops the means to control this power, right? And so this is why there are no aliens in the sky. There are no aliens in the sky because they cannot solve the fool's problem. Because life in general cannot solve the fool's problem. This is why there are no aliens in the sky. Think about this. Think about this, right? I mean this quite seriously. I mean, this is the quote we've been talking about with respect to Marx the other day, right? This, gemeinsames Untergang der kämpfenden Klassen, right? That the class struggle ends with the victory of the progressive class or the common ruin of the contending classes. Common ruin of the contending classes is very easy to imagine in 2021. Actually, much easier to imagine than it was in times of Hobbes or in times of Marx, actually, right? So there's a lot to say here, and this topic we kept mentioning last year about ataraxia and pleonexia, right? Hobbes is very much on the ataraxia side. He thinks the king Leviathan is the king of the children of pride. This pleonexia is the primary motivation for the fools, for the fools, right? And it is a very dangerous and destabilizing force in society. And Hobbes, um, basically, that's the core of his argument. Like, don't make trouble, obey the laws. it's going to be better for everyone in the long run. Again, not to mention that Hobbes has this vision of, again, competition, and I keep repeating that because I think it's super important in my reading of Hobbes. Competition between states forces the states to take good care of the citizens, right? And again, think about, no. Let's take a moment. Let's pause here, right? Let's think of Russia in the 90s, right? So Russia in the 90s was a very dreadful place to be around. But one thing that has happened is brain drain, right? Brain drain. Think about this in Hobbesian terms, right? Hobbes is going to say that places like, I don't know, the UK, US, EU, right? They were all very interested in highly qualified Soviet or former Soviet workers, if you want, right? So they want to invite former Soviet, how do you say this? Um, experts in the sense of, people with outstanding expertise, high skilled workers. um and and you could ask, well, in Hobbesian terms, why would you do that? Well, there's a certain competition between sovereigns, right? And if you can actually uh lure the subjects of another state to join your state, well, that sounds like an excellent idea, right? And in general, well, anyway, I don't Hobbes doesn't exactly talk about this, obviously, but I want to say that there are certain connections, right? So when people ask me what is the liberal side of Hobbes, broadly speaking, this is the liberal side of Hobbes, that competition between states forces the sovereigns to take care of their subjects. And when we say take care of the subjects, yeah, to make not just laws, because all laws are by definition just, but also to make good laws, which are good laws are the ones that are needful for the good of the people, right? So there's this possibility of progress. Now, of course, this is all predicated on the idea of competition. And in many ways, we run into, in the 21st century, we run into this problem with Marx, right? The coercive laws of competition in the market. Competition between states is exactly what is preventing us from solving the global challenges, such as pollution, nuclear proliferation, global warming, etc., etc. But who knows? We'll see. We'll see. This is a some of my friends believe that the next 50 years are going to be something interesting, but possibly very dreadful is going to happen to humanity. I don't know. I'm not sure. I mostly read about the past. I'm not strong about predictions about the future, but this is something definitely to think about. Okay. Little bit of a digression there. Okay, we're good. Approximately. Other questions about Taylor Warner, maybe? Well, I suppose I should tell you, Vladimir, the philosopher in this course who makes me most optimistic is definitely Mill. Definitely Mill. Because of his, again, distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Because, like, if it is true that higher pleasures are actually more pleasant than lower pleasures, this provides a roadmap for human progress, right? And notice, right? So if there's like an intrinsic motivation in favor of higher pleasures above the lower pleasures, right? Then you don't need to invent this institutional structure that will rein people in, right? This institutions that will force less than virtuous people to behave pro-socially. If Mill is right, and higher pleasures are better than lower pleasures, then you don't need to force people to behave pro-socially. Then people are naturally pro-social, or at least they're naturally pro-social. Maybe once we reach a certain stage of social development. Once we Anyway. Okay. No more hands. Well, but I hope this is at least somewhat stimulating. Let me go back to Barcher's text. This was the bit on Taylor-Warner. That's why I wanted to read it more carefully. But other things I think we can cover more superficially. So this passage talks about Macpherson. So definitely check Macpherson out. Macpherson is a Marxist critique of Hobbes. It's fairly straightforward. Again, assumption of self-interest is competitive individualism, right? Oxford introduction actually has a very nice explanation of Macpherson's thesis. You don't even have to read Macpherson himself. You can just look at Oxford intro, and it's it's going to be enough. I think there's a footnote there. Yeah. So if you go to Hobbes, and you see here Leviathan Oxford intro, right? And if we search for Macpherson, oops. Yeah, this is on page 30. On page 30, there's a detailed discussion of what Macpherson is saying, right? So page 30 and page 31. I highly encourage you to look at that. And okay, back to the text. So yeah. So another thing, I guess I want to. Oh yeah. Of course, there's Gene Hampton also. There's Gene Hampton and David Gautier. And the question is similar. In fact, it's similar to the question that Vladimir has asked a second ago. And is this luck on Vladimir's part? Well, this is the central question of political philosophy, right? So Gene Hampton suggests that Hobbes' description of the state of nature is not a genuine prisoner's dilemma game, but rather a situation where self-interest inclines individuals to cooperate. This is in many ways a continuation of this line of argument that we have been talking about. Is cooperation in self-interest? So is the state of nature a genuine prisoner's dilemma game, or is it a coordination game or stag hunt, right? This is an important question. So when we talk about this is also related to the first mover problem. Yeah. So Hampton says creating a civil society therefore requires merely the cooperation of self-interested individuals rather than a full-fledged social contract. That's the whole idea of Hampton, that humans are not as antisocial as Hobbes wants us to think. That's why the government will and necessarily has to be limited. One other thing I guess I want to mention about Hampton is, again, she has this important notion. Again, she talks about this. Maybe you should probably look this up in her own book, Rebel's Catechism, talking about Leviathan as Rebel's Catechism. Let me spend a moment trying to explain this. Right. So imagine the contract is void upon a reasonable suspicion that the sovereign cannot or will not protect me. The contract is void upon reasonable suspicion.
Well, then what is to be considered a reasonable suspicion is a question.
Yes, exactly. This is why this is called Rebel's Catechism. So Rebel's Catechism, something like Manifest Buntarya, right? So the idea that Leviathan is a book that promotes dissent, right? So like, far from being a defender of absolute sovereignty, on this reading, Hobbes is a promoter of complete disobedience or something like that, right? And so you imagine. imagine you imagine you're in Britain, for example, and the mayor of a town does well. You know what? No. Imagine COVID. Imagine COVID, right? So this is an example I gave last January, and your town or your city calls for a quarantine, and you think in your head that actually what this is going to lead to is that the economy is going to collapse and there's going to be riots in the streets tomorrow. And so in this action of creating a lockdown, you foresee that you will no longer be protected, let's say a month or a couple of months down the line, or maybe a year down the line. So right now, immediately, therefore, the contract, you think in your head, becomes void, right? And supposedly then you can take Leviathan and use this as an excuse to say, oh, contract is void, old sovereign is no more, we're back in the state of nature, we're free to take matters into your own hands, right? So, and here's the biggest question is this: what where do you draw the line? What is a reasonable suspicion? And like what? How do we answer this question? I don't think that there's necessarily a very good answer. I mean, it's clear that Hobbes himself assumes that people will be very conservative and people will be very careful and people will wait very long until considering the contract void. Only in the direst of circumstances will we consider that the contract is void. But at the end of the day, it's up to us. It's a matter of individual decision, right? So this introduces a bit of an uncertainty in Hobbesian system. And so I want to say Hobbes solves this problem by assumption. Hobbes just solves this problem by assuming that these situations will not happen, but will they or won't they? Right? That's a good question. That's a good question.
Or
So,
once again,
huh?
Professor, is it like justified to say that Hobbes once again engages in wishful thinking that, oh well, people will be careful in assuming that the contract is void, or is it not valid this time?
Uh-huh. Well, let me give you so like the short answer for the University of London is you decide. But let me give you my own opinion. So my own opinion, which you don't have to agree with, obviously, is that Hobbes does not have a solution to the fool's problem. Really, I don't think that Hobbes has a solution to the fool's problem. The way he sets this up, he just dodges the issue. And I think that if Hobbes did not engage in wishful thinking, he would have had to say that, yeah, it depends on the institutional arrangement of society, and sometimes it may happen that it's in the interest of individual to violate the social contract, and they will violate it, and there's nothing to do about it, right? So this is the fool's problem. I don't think that Hobbes really has a very good solution. But when we talk here about rebel's catechism, I think that Hobbes' solution is much better. You could also say it's wishful thinking, but it depends on what your estimation is. It depends on what your view of the world is, right? Right. And my view of the world, my view of history, in this sense, is just more in line with Hobbes. I think that indeed people are conservative enough. And well, again, like when you had okay, you had COVID protesters, right, in various countries in the world. But did this really lead to mass rioting or breakdown of civil authority? Well, in most places, no. In most places, no. So it's like I don't think that at the end of the day it's a real problem. So it's like it is maybe a slightly weaker point in Hobbes's reasoning, but in general, I personally I am satisfied with Hobbes's assumptions. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Fool's problem is very difficult because I think we need to look at Hobbes's text, because I'm getting Humean vibes. You remember Hume says that it's like echoing Epicurus. Hume says that it's never worth breaking the law, because you break the law, what do you get? Okay, you stole something, you get a bunch of worthless toys. Worthless toys is the phrase that David Hume uses. And I think I'm having some weird flashbacks. I think I saw a similar idea in Hobbes somewhere, right? So Hobbes is going to like, compared to the safety of your life, which you get by the contract, the advantages that you get by breaking the contract are just minuscule and tiny. But again, is this a good answer? Because it's like people break the rules all the time, and people get away with crime all the time, and society does not collapse. Now, of course, once crime reaches a certain threshold, once there's enough crime in society may collapse. But it takes a certain amount of time for us to get there. So, fool's problem in this sense is, it's not clear. It's not clear. you can talk about some like universal surveillance, but then you run into this question of who's gonna survey the surveyors, right? So if you have a system of surveillance, but who oversees the overseers? I mean, Marx has a theoretical solution, I think, which looks nice in both these anarchist distributed communes. But the question is, how do you get there, and are they really viable, especially in the nuclear age? So the fool's problem really keeps me up at night. But this one, this one doesn't. But I wanted to signal that it's there. Okay, so and in the last portion here, they talk about again these three treatises that you notice they talk about this reply to the fool. This is the fool's problem. Sorry, yeah. So the three treatises, the elements of law, the Chive, and the Leviathan, right? And the problems that come with this. The problems basically that actually Leviathan is less a text and more stitched together from earlier drafts, and you know, sometimes things may be hard to reconstruct. Yeah, so they talk about how this we think, yeah, that the lengthy and peculiar process of composition results in Leviathan being a pastiche of arguments, changing times and Hobbes changing interest, right? They talk about unsystematic nature of the Leviathan and potential contradictions in the Leviathan, something to keep in mind. And in general, Baumgold, he says it makes sense to drop the assumption of coherence of the Leviathan. So basically, the most important, so solipsism and egoism, this is, I think, less interesting. I know we're running out of time, but let me just, yeah. So they talk about, they talk about the fool's problem in this passage once again. We could look at it, but I would propose you read this very carefully on your own. Yeah, it's like Hobbes' reply to the fool, right? The upshot is to collapse any distinction between egoistic and moral behavior by redescribing morality as prudential behavior and ignoring situations where duty might diverge from interest. You see, this is Deborah Baumgold telling you that Hobbes doesn't have a very good solution to the fool's problem, right? So you redescribe morality as prudence, and you ignore the situations in which duty might diverge from self-interest. That's not a very good solution. Yeah. Hobbes seems never to have imagined that selfishness is at odds with altruism and other moral sentiments. It's definitely a problem. So then the last section, and we'll decide, well, I'll have some time to think of what we're going to do in the next lecture, before the next lecture begins. But anyway, so they talk about these three distinct lines of argument in the Leviathan, right? And our assumption is that they don't necessarily have to be consistent. So the first one is agency, the second one is non-resistance compact, and the third one is this idea of mutual relation between protection and obedience. And I want to say, personally, in my own head, I just go with the third. The first one basically says I must obey because I promised, because it's like I must obey because I must obey the sovereign, right? Because I authorized the sovereign, and therefore sovereign's decision is my decision. I don't like this line of argument, and I don't think it works very well. Partly because what happens when the contract becomes void and who decides, right? So the second line of argument is this non-resistance compact, and here basically the idea is that I must obey the sovereign because otherwise, you know, otherwise we go back to the state of nature. I must obey the sovereign because it's impossible. It's impossible for subjects to limit sovereign's authority. You know, because contract must be unilateral. You can't have a contract between subjects and sovereign. Maybe, and there's something to be said for this. But the third line, now this one is the clearest. This one is the clearest, and this is the one I like the most. Again, it's basically this idea of mutual relation between protection and obedience, mutual relation. And there are some passages I could point to in explaining that, right? And lastly, they talk a little bit about Michael Oakeshott, and I would imagine that sort of the most important idea is that Oakeshott thought that Hobbes was self-consistent and tried to make him systematic, but actually at the end of the day, Hobbes not very self-consistent, and it's hard to make Hobbes systematic. So it's best to read the Leviathan as a pastiche of different arguments. And this is, in a nutshell, this is this is the end of Boucher, basically. I wanted to just briefly look at a passage. I'm just looking for it. Yeah. So let me switch back. Okay. So in support, this is the last thing I'm going to say today. Well, I mean, before the break, right? So if we look at de facto authority, I think that the clearest statement of Hobbes's allegiance to de facto authority is in this passage. This is from chapter on freedom. I think it's chapter 20 or something. Chapter 21. Chapter on freedom. This is actually in Kant. So for the act of our submission consists both obligation and our liberty. So consists our obligation. Obligation, let's say, okay. Our obligation to the sovereign must be inferred by arguments, or let's say by following arguments. So all obligation arises from some act of man, right? All men are equally by nature free. And because such arguments must either be drawn from express words, I authorize his actions, or from the intention of him that submits himself to the power, which intention is to be understood by the end for which he so submits. So your intention should be understood from the end of submission, right? The obligation and liberty of the subject is derived from either these words or other equivalent, else from the institution of the sovereignty. So this is the key phrase. So your obligation could be inferred from the end of the institution of sovereignty, namely the peace of the subjects with themselves and their defense against the common enemy. So again, like if somebody tells you that Hobbes is a social contract theorist, look at this passage. Look at this passage. What does he say? He says that our obligation could depend on our words, But in principle, our obligation could be derived simply from the purpose of the institution of sovereignty, namely the peace of subjects with themselves. So basically, if you're being protected, you must obey. If you're being protected, we assume that you have consented. And even if in your head you 100% do not consent, we just think that maybe you're a madman. And it doesn't matter. And we still assume that you consent, even if you scream and shout that you don't consent. This is the most vivid formulation of the de facto authority that I have seen from the Leviathan. Okay, anyway,